Welcome to the Bad Roman Podcast. On this show, we talk with veterans, community leaders, Christians and non-Christians as we explore the entanglement of Christians with the state. The Bad Roman Project was created out of the firm belief that as Christians, we are called to follow Christ, not the state. Here is your host, Craig Hargis.
Hey folks, let's talk Israel and Palestine. This topic seems to cause a lot of confusion among Christians and non-Christians alike in the Western world. We are taught to stand up for Israel without fail, but I'm no longer convinced that is the route we should be taking, so I invited Daniel Benora on the show, who will give us a perspective as a Christian Palestinian. Buckle up, folks, because Daniel has a lot to say on this topic, and he comes with a wealth of knowledge.
Let's go. Yeah. Left, right, left, right, left. We got our marching orders, man. Left, right. We'd rather serve God than serve Caesar, you feel me? Right. I'm just trying to live what he said. I'm just trying to live what he said.
Daniel, how are you doing?
Hey, Craig. I'm doing well. I'm doing okay. It's been tough for the last 4 weeks. I have a number of friends in Gaza that I haven't heard from in a bit. 4 of my friends have lost family members. A friend lost her dad. A friend lost his brother, and another friend lost 2 of his cousins. And it's been really awful. Just to follow up with what's happening. Also, some Christians were killed in a church 2-3 weeks ago. 18 Christians were killed they were sheltering in a church, in the Orthodox church in Gaza, and even Christians sheltering in a church. They couldn't escape the onslaught of the Israeli strikes against the Palestinians. So I'm okay. But I'm also not okay, right? I'm in the U.S. right now in a very privileged, safe space. But my heart is in Gaza. My heart is with my people, the Palestinians, whether in the Gaza Strip, whether in the West Bank, whether in Jerusalem, whether in Israel proper. So it's been hard. It's been a hard season for me. Just kind of checking up on my friends, and some of my friends I haven't heard from since the beginning of the attacks. And kind of you expect the worst, but we just have to pray, as we say, pray for a ceasefire, pray for God's goodness and justice and truth to prevail at the end, and pray for the protection of the people of Gaza. So far, today is November 7th, and we're talking about more than 10,000 Gazans have been killed so far. So it's very heartbreaking to me and to a lot of Palestinians and allies for Palestine and for justice in Palestine and Israel.
I saw something yesterday, and I'm paraphrasing what I saw, but it caught me off guard. It was said that Israel's dropped more bombs in the past week or 2 weeks than the United States did an entire year in Afghanistan.
Right, yeah, I saw that as well.
And they're comparing the size of Afghanistan to the size of Gaza. And you imagine the amount of bombs that they're dropping just on a small area of Gaza compared to the entire country of Afghanistan. I can't imagine the terror that's going through these people. I hope they understand when they listen to this episode is we're not defending Hamas or Israel. That's not what we're doing. I think you come from it the same way I do, that we're standing with people who are caught in the middle of this, that the women and the children, and we're going to talk about blowback as well as the show goes along too. But I think that's something that people need to kind of understand when it comes to what's happening there, because as I mentioned in the opener, is that there's a lot of confusion when it comes to Christians in the West with Palestine and Israel. And I was very confused about a lot of stuff that I was learning about. Like I told you before we started recording, I had always just assumed that there was a nation state of Israel, and that's just not true.
Yeah, yep.
And I've heard this described as war. I've heard this described as genocide. I've heard this described as an occupation. And to me, it sounds like occupation is where it started, and now it's turned into a genocide.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in what you're saying, Craig. But yeah, it's a legacy of 75 years. For many in the West and in the U.S., they want to pretend that this began on October 7th. Out of the blue, nothing is happening. A wonderful country of Israel, a liberal democracy, the startup nation that is living at peace. And somehow some people, for some reason, do not like Israel. But, for the most part, Israel is doing well and everything is fine. And then October 7th happens, and there's just outcry and shock. What? How could this happen? Why would they attack us? Why do they hate us? But I think that discourse is fundamentally racist because it ignores the Palestinians, the indigenous population of Palestine, of the land, before Israel came to be in 1948. And we have been pushed, Palestinian Christians and Muslims, Christians are a small minority in the population, but we have been pushed to the background. We're not that significant. We're not that interesting. We don't have anything to say. We don't have a story. We don't have any legitimate qualms. We don't have any hurt, or we don't face any oppression or any violence. And this is something that Israel has done well to convince the West that it's a good country, and even the discourse about what's happening and about Hamas, it continues to be that way. There's no consideration of the context or the history. Neither context or history are understood or explained in this. And the discourse, which has been shocking to me, at least in the beginning, saw this as kind of a part of a regional conflict and mostly centering the U.S. Like, it's all about the U.S. It's all about U.S. national interests. It's all about Iran and Israel and the U.S. and China. And again, I mean, it's the same racist discourse that eliminates the Palestinians, that makes them less than human, who have nothing to say, have no story to tell, and it's all about the U.S., it's all about Israel, it's all about our allies, and it's deeply disturbing. And so when we're talking about 10,000 people killed now, I'm gonna be shocked. Like, when people listen to this podcast, like, how many people are gonna be dead by then, right? Because the numbers are insane. And mention the bombing and that what that looks like. But Israel is kind of hell-bent on destroying Palestinians. This is not a war against Gaza. I mean, it's not a war against Hamas. This is a war against all Palestinians, in Gaza especially, but also in the West Bank. We have more than 150 Palestinians who have been killed in Gaza, in the West Bank. Also attacks on Palestinian citizens of Israel, or what Israel calls Arab Israelis. And here Israel is not looking for justice. It's not looking to, defend, or like this language of self-defense and proportionality is super problematic, because this is not self-defense when you are aiming for destruction and not accuracy. When you have genocidal language coming out from ministers in the government, from Bibi Netanyahu himself, also how he used the Bible to compare the Palestinians to the Amalekites, which in the Bible were ethnically cleansed, where there's like clear commandments about killing children and men and women and destroying trees and so on and so forth. And that genocidal language, whether in the political discourse, you see it from the politicians, finish them off or give them hell. This is like Jordan Peterson, or like Haley who's running for the president, Nikki Haley, or anyone else. This kind of genocidal language, and if you're just gonna take that person, the American or the Israeli, and you switch them with like a Muslim, they become the terrorists. But if Christians are saying it's making this genocidal racist language, oh yeah, no, that's totally fine. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's kill them all. Yeah. Palestinians, yeah. And we can talk about terrorism and how this kind of term has been used to dehumanize all Palestinians, not just Hamas, but also Hamas, because they are a terrorist group, because they did what they did. Therefore, let's kill them all without due process, without reflection, without trying to understand what's happening. And it's super, super problematic. And this is for the Palestinians. Like, in many ways, like, all of us are just traumatized and shocked at the amount of like destruction and death and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There's no electricity, no water, no food, no medical supplies. The UN described this a few days ago, that the Gaza Strip has become a graveyard for children. And there's a lot to say about what Gaza looked like even before the beginning of this war. But yeah, the amount of destruction, the disregard for the Palestinian life, for the Palestinian dignity, for the humanity of all Palestinians has been like abhorrent and really, really vile. And especially when the Bible has been used and continues to be used to justify all of this.
Yeah, it's something that's so disturbing to me now. The way I look at this situation now, and I don't really know. I hate to call it a situation, because it's more than just a situation. And please feel free to correct me as we go along, because like I said, my ignorance on this topic is pretty vast. So if I say something that sounds offensive or whatever, please correct me, because like I said, I'm going by my old way of thinking and trying to work my way out of that. And before we get too far, I'd still like for you to give us a little background yourself, because you mentioned something about terrorism. And anybody listening that's familiar with the Bad Roman podcast, I've often said that the United States government is a terrorist organization, maybe one of the largest terrorist organizations this world's ever seen. And now I look at the Israeli government the same way. Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to call Hamas a terrorist organization, I'm hearing these conversations in the break room at work, and I'm grateful. There's a guy I work with. He was born in Syria. His family lives in Turkey, but he understands a lot of what's going on there. So I've been able to kind of sit down in the break room and have conversations with him. And he's explaining to me what's going on there and what Gaza is. Like, I just assumed, I didn't understand what Gaza was. And he was explaining to me like Hamas is like when we think of like Republicans and Democrats, they're just another political party. And I don't know if he's accurate when he says that. Maybe you can kind of clarify that as we go along as well too. But before we get too far ahead, just let folks know a little bit about yourself, because you were born in Jerusalem, if I'm not mistaken, raised in Bethlehem. So that's kind of interesting. It's going to be interesting to the listeners as well. So why don't you flex a little bit and tell us a little about yourself, and then we'll get into the topic.
Right. Yeah. So I was born in Jerusalem. My family is from Bethlehem. It's not from Bethlehem, the city itself. It's from, my family, the Bannoura family, is from the town of Beit Sahur, which is just east of Bethlehem, a small town. In biblical terms, Beit Sahur, my hometown, is the shepherd's field. But like in how we think about the shepherd's field, we think it's just like a suburb of Bethlehem. But it's right now it's a different town. It's basically the farmland of Bethlehem that over time became its own village and then city, and so on and so forth. But my family is from Beit Sahur. The Bannoura family, I can at least trace my genealogy as a Bannoura for 13 generations of Palestinians who have been living in Beit Sahur in Bethlehem for that long. Palestinian, Christian, and Arab. I speak Arabic as my mother's tongue, and in many ways that connects me to Arabs throughout the Middle East and North Africa. But being Palestinian is also very distinct, just like being an American who speaks English is very different from an Australian who speaks English, right? Or a Brit who speaks English. So like the language is something that we connect on linguistically, but not culturally or nationally or so on. But so I speak Arabic as a Christian, and I can talk about my Christian identity, but as a Palestinian, the people of the land who have historically lived in the land for generations and generations, like I said, 13 generations for my family, and my family is an insignificant kind of small family. But Palestinians are the people of the land that called Palestine home, the area between the river and the sea, as their home. And that includes mostly Muslims, historically speaking at least, and also Christians, and also a small minority of Palestinian Jews who continuously lived in the land alongside Muslims and Christians, of course, and also some other minorities like Samaritans, like the Druze, Baha'is, and other kind of small religious and ethnic minorities that called Palestine home. The Christian minority that I belong to, Christians right now depending what area, what geography you want to think about, but in the whole land, Christians are 5% of the population. I think even less now. In the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, which is the Palestinian territories, they're down to 1%, and a large number of Christians, whether for natural reasons, for like low birth rates, or for immigration and so on, and especially due to the political and economic reality, many of them opted out. And there's like a massive kind of brain drain of Palestinian Christians because of their connections to the West, mostly go to private Christian schools, which give them access to many languages, English or what have you. And so a lot of them kind of have that mobility to migrate and move out. My family is historically Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and that's kind of the original, if you will, faith in Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and Jordan. But my immediate family is actually evangelical. So my dad is a Baptist pastor. So I grew up as a pastor's kid. A few members of my family are now evangelical. I kind of moved away from Baptist, defining myself as Baptist or evangelical. I still kind of adhere to some evangelical thinking, and But I kind of see myself kind of moving beyond those labels and following Christ and the way of Christ. That is more important to me than the title itself. Attended a Lutheran church in Palestine before I came to the US, and now I go to what is called a post-evangelical church in the US. I'm right now in the US. I am finishing my PhD studies at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. I'm in the theology department. I work on late antique history and the rise of Islam in relation to Christianity. So unrelated to a topic tonight. And then my Palestinian identity as a Christian kind of play a role in how I think about the world, and especially about what's happening today. And the Palestinian voice I mentioned has been like silenced and ignored for the most part, especially in the West, especially in the US, which is also confusing and frustrating. But also Christian Palestinians, who are a small minority, have gone through a lot, have been in the land for 2,000 years, mostly ignored. And, people are so confused when we talk about, we are Christian Palestinians. And the first thing they ask us is like, when did you convert? Or, shouldn't you be Muslim? And it's just like that level of ignorance and apathy, and is insane to me. But there's a lot to say about the legacy of Eastern Christianity and Palestinian Christianity. But yeah, that's in a nutshell kind of my identity and my background.
Well, it's interesting you said that, is when they want to know when you converted. This is how far the ignorance goes, even where my ignorance used to be. For some reason, Christians in the West are surprised to hear that there's Christian Palestinians. Like for some reason, there's this assumption that they're all Muslims.
Right.
And that's not true.
Yeah.
So when Israel's attacking Gaza, they're attacking Christians, and you got Christians in the West that are celebrating this and supporting Israel killing other Christians. The mental gymnastics that has to go around to try to get around this stuff with people these days is so mind-boggling to me, because it's like you get stuck in the mud and you get stuck in this way of thinking that you can't get past because your pastor's telling you this. And I'm telling you, man, I used to be that way because my pastor was telling me this back in Israel. And this is how far my ignorance was, is I believed, and I don't remember where those passages in the Bible, but it said that those who protect Israel will be blessed. And I don't know if you're familiar with what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So
those who bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse Israel will be cursed, right?
When I read that, back in my old way of thinking, I was like, well, God created the United States to protect Israel.
Right.
That's what I used to believe.
Right.
And I've talked about that on the show before. I don't believe that anymore. I don't believe that God created any nation state, honestly. But I think that's a lot of what's going on in the church. When messaging you, I wanted to talk about corporate media propaganda, because we're seeing a lot of that, especially if you're spending too much time watching Fox News and they're talking about all this garbage, calling people terrorists and not recognizing that Israel's a terrorist organization. And you got people in the middle of this that are caught and stuck in the middle of this and being slaughtered by the tens of thousands. And you got Christians celebrating it. Mm-hmm. This has got to stop. And this is why I'm happy you're on the show today, because I'm hoping that this conversation can get shared by everybody that listens, to people that need to hear this conversation, because there's a lot of ignorance in the church.
Right.
And I think it starts behind the pulpit, and I think it starts behind corporate media as well. And I think they're all kind of in cahoots at some point together too with this. And there's maybe the pastors are confused. I don't know, but it comes back, like you said, your dad's a Baptist preacher. My time spent in the Southern Baptist Church, I believed in dispensationalism. I thought everybody believed that there was going to be a rapture. And I used to print newspapers, and I watched everything going on in Israel, and I was just waiting to see that Jesus was returned, and the Antichrist was going to be revealed, and all this garbage that we're taught with dispensationalism. I think that's a huge problem too when it comes to what's going on with how people believe Israel should be defended at all costs when it comes to Palestine.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, Craig. But I'll get to one of the main points you mentioned, which is this phenomenon where Palestinian Christians or Christians in the Middle East are not part of how people think about the Middle East. I mean, part of it is ignorance, of course, and I think it's even more devious and more sinister than that. It's part, I think, of also speak about racism again, of this colonial mentality of racism. We are the Christians, we the white folks from Europe, and by extension the US. We are the Christians, we are the good guys, and Muslims are the bad guys. And there's a lot to say about all the history of all of that and colonialism. It's a phenomenon called Orientalism. Edward Said, an American Palestinian scholar at Columbia, wrote basically the book on Orientalism, which is basically ex, exposes the very harmful, bigoted attitude towards Muslims and Arabs. And part of that colonial mentality is to give give these general stereotypes about that people, those who are different than you, if you are a white Christian. So how do you want to paint the Middle East? You paint the Middle East as backwards, as Muslim, as uncivilized, as savage, as violent, and you name it. But then you have to maintain that image. Like, you have to maintain that stereotype that the Middle East is violent and it's backwards. And you hear politicians, when you talk about like even the insurrection on January 5th, and I hear this happen all the time, like, this doesn't even happen in the third world, because we are the good civilized people, but those savages only exist in the third world. And by the third world, it basically it's anyone who's not the West or is not Russia is the third world. So Africa, Asia, these are the backwards people. So when we come and say, hey, we actually are more diverse, and we actually have a lot of culture and history and music and philosophy and theology coming from the East, from the Middle East, we're actually a very multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multilingual society. The majority are Muslims. Yeah, I mean, that's a fact. But they have so many different religious minorities and ethnicities and languages. But in the Western mind, these are just the backwards Arab Muslims, and there's no nuance and there's no context, and that's I think that's a legacy of colonialism that still impacts the modern Western mind, and I think it's fundamentally driven by a racist impulse to see yourself as better than the other. We cannot look at nuance. We cannot look at diversity. We're the good guys, ergo, therefore they are the bad guys. And how do we define the bad guys? The bad guy is the Muslim or the Arab. And so that the discourse about we need to support Israel, well, we are the good guys. We have an interest in supporting Israel for whatever political or theological reasons. And you mentioned dispensationalism. So they're the good guys. We're the good guys. Anyone who opposes us, the good guys, by definition, is the bad guy. But then Palestinian Christians or others enter into the room. It's like, what about us, guys? Like, how do you fit us in that binary, fundamentally racist discourse? We don't really fit. And that's kind of where, Craig, you're doing this through the podcast, and where people have to do, their due diligence and actually move away from these binary, unhelpful, quasi-racist ways of thinking, and actually try to embrace complexity and nuance in the way we think about anyone who's different from you.
Well, yeah, I'm convinced that Sean Hannity thinks that Jesus has blue eyes and blonde hair too.
Right? Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Just to listen to him, and man, I don't spend hardly any time watching corporate media, but it's on in the break room, and that's the only time I do see it. And he's always on when I go to my first break at work, and just to see the stuff coming out of his mouth, man, it's pretty gross. And the problem is there's a lot of people that think that way, and it's interesting to sit in that break room and listen to the conversations going on around, but what's being said on that TV, because you got one side of the bunch thinking that Israel's right and should defend themselves, and then you got another side, like I told you, my friend, my coworker, who was born in Syria. He's telling me the stuff he's saying. You should see the looks on some of these folks' faces when he's talking, because they've never heard this from anybody. You can tell they've never heard what he's saying from Sean Hannity, obviously, when he's talking and explaining Gaza and the West Bank and explaining that it's an occupation, that it's always Palestine. So it's Palestine. It's that Israel is not part of Palestine. It's an occupation. And just to hear him talk about that, it really throws these guys for a loop. And I like listening to him talk and watching him explain this to them, because I can learn something from him. We have a new guy. He's from Africa. He's Muslim. Didn't know he was Muslim, but he mentioned it. But he was sitting there and he's watching this stuff on the news. He goes, "This is garbage. This is garbage. This is not, none of this is true what they're telling you." And I think I can't stand corporate media. And I think that besides what happens behind the pulpit, I think the corporate media is the biggest problem right now because people latch onto it. I like to see that people are moving away from it and starting to listen to more podcasts.
Yeah.
Because they're kind of sick of it too. But you still got those old hats that are going to sit there and want to watch the same garbage they've been watching. I mean, I used to watch Fox News religiously, but you probably wouldn't understand that or know that because my old way of thinking was. It'll corrupt your mind if you sit there and take that as religion and take it as your faith, that it's very bad for you to sit there and listen to that stuff.
Yeah, and this is kind of evident in also how the media has been reporting on the last four weeks. It's been abhorrent to see this warmongering, disregard for the humanity of the Palestinians, whitewashing their suffering, and even like, and you're focusing on the media, and I get it. I mean, the media is very complicit in this, but it also goes beyond this. It goes back to the president and his attitudes. Like, I mean, obviously, unequivocal, unconditional, unwavering support for Israel, no matter what. And there's a very disturbing, unhealthy, really toxic relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and kind of the influence of the Israel lobby in American politics and AIPAC, basically the largest lobby group in the U.S. And all the money they're funneling into Congress to support candidates and congresspeople to basically create this gang of pro-Israel kind of congresspeople who support Israel no matter what. So it begins from Biden, who is famously says that he's a Zionist, goes to the whole political kind of hierarchy. Most Democrats, all of Republicans, really haven't heard anyone today who's nuanced and who cares about the humanitarian condition or questioning what Israel is doing. Only hear some voices in the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders, who's like, well, hey, like we need to put conditions on Israel, how it uses our weapons. People like Rashida Tlaib, who's a Palestinian American congressperson in the House, who's been very critical, and some other people from the Progressive Caucus, like Cory Bush and AOC and others who have been very vocal and emphasizing that we need to talk about the history and the context. We need to understand that what's happening right now is a genocide and war crimes are being committed. And the stuff that you're hearing from the news is insane. But only these are who are considered, the far left in American politics are saying this stuff. But for the most part, it starts with the president, with Congress, and then makes its way into the media as well. And also, Craig, you mentioned this as well, the church, your pastors. And I don't know if it's pastors who are influenced by the media or if it's the seminaries and the churches that teach these things, and dispensationalism, which goes before the media, right? And how that thinking, that Zionist thinking, that you need to bless Israel to be blessed, you need to support Israel no matter what, so that Christ would come back.
Right.
And that predates the corporate media in the US today. So there's this is a multi-layered just cesspool of warmongering, of violence, of whitewashing oppression that is, starts from the president and goes all the way down.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the president and some of these folks in Congress too, because that's another thing that I've noticed. I know a lot of people that are on the left who are anti-war, but they tend to go silent for some reason when their version of the monster is in office. Mm-hmm. And today their version of the monster is Joe Biden. And the folks in Congress who are speaking out against Israel and this war, this attack on the Palestinians, they're getting blasted. They're getting blasted in the media. They're getting blasted by other politicians, and I'm pretty sure they're getting blasted in the churches too. And then you see all these pro-Palestinian demonstrations, and basically these folks are looked upon as supporting terrorism. No, these folks are supporting the people of Palestine. That's what they're doing. There's nothing wrong with that. Somebody needs to start talking about it, because if we're just bombarded with the same garbage that we hear from the media, from the president, from the churches, and nothing else is being said, that's just what everybody's going to believe. People need to start being loud about it. I have no problem with these protests. at all. And I'm not saying that they're defending Hamas. I think they're defending the children and the women that are getting slaughtered by Israel.
Surely we can have some nuance. Like, surely you can say, I reject Hamas. I think what Hamas did was vile. It's a heinous attack on civilians and so on. And in the same breath, without pausing, without a comma, and I also condemn and reject the death and destruction and the genocide committed against the people in Gaza. Like, surely you can have our brains are wired in a way to hold complex ideas. You would hope, you would hope that that's possible. But surely condemning Hamas doesn't have to be, oh, therefore I'm going to be pro-Israel, I'm going to kill them all. Or being critical of Israel doesn't mean that you support Hamas. It just doesn't, that's not how it works. We need to be thoughtful, serious thinkers, and the way we think about the context of all of this. But the reason, again, I don't want to overemphasize this, the reason that people, whenever they hear Palestinians, demanding justice or the end of the occupation or ceasefire, the reason that they say, well, this is anti-Israel, this is anti-Semitic, it's fundamentally comes from this place where Palestinians do not matter. So when we're saying we need justice for the Palestinians, we need the end of the blockade in Gaza, we need the end of the occupation. I don't know how much, Craig, you want to go into the history of the conflict, but it began in 47 and 48 when Israel was established and the majority of Palestinians were kicked out.
I think it's important, if you don't mind kind of going over that for us, because I think it's important for the listener to understand that how this started, why it started, and how it's being misrepresented today as we speak.
Yeah, and I can mention some references for people to look up and study. There are fantastic books written by Palestinian historians, by Israeli historians, and by others that unpack all of this. But basically, the Palestinians are the indigenous people of the land. Let me see if I can do this in 5 minutes, right? So the Palestinians are the people in the land who have been living there, including Muslims, Christians, and Jews, a small minority of Jews. Zionism began in the late 19th century. The father of Zionism is a guy called Herzl. And him and some other European Jews believed in this idea of a Jewish national restoration, finding for themselves a place to live. This is part of a large anti-Semitic problem, what is called the Jewish problem in the West, which is what to do with the Jews. We don't want the Jews. They killed Jesus, the blood libel, and very nasty anti-Semitic rhetoric. And Jews were like, you know what, we're fed up. We want to have our own homeland that we can live in. Some suggestions were made for them to be in Argentina or some country in Africa. Eventually, they settled on Palestine. And then they lobbied heavily the British Empire to help facilitate their migration, their transfer into Palestine. Most of these were secular Jews. Most of them did not really care too much about the idea of the Promised Land or what have you, but it was a bit convenient for them to pursue Palestine, because it's part of a Jewish legacy that they were, aware of, not really that they believed in it. Actually, most Jews at the time rejected Zionism because it was seen as an idolatry, as a way to replace God. You're replacing the Messiah, who in Jewish thinking is the one who would restore the fortunes of Israel, the king, the Davidic king who would come. And Jews, through their Talmud and their teachings, we're expecting the Messiah to come. And whenever the Messiah comes, he'll bring him back. But then Zionism says, no, we're going to establish our own secular leftist homeland in Palestine. And the majority of Jews were like, no, that doesn't work. But anyway, they were successful in lobbying in Britain especially. Now, by 1917, the British mandate was enforced on Palestine. Previously, Palestine was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And then there's something called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, where the French and the British divided up the Middle East through these kind of boundary lines they made up without consulting the indigenous populations of those lands. And Britain had control over Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, and other areas. And then in 1917, after so much lobbying, the Prime Minister of Britain at the time, Lord Balfour, who was a Christian Zionist himself, who was also anti-Semitic, who was personally invested in moving Jews out of Europe, sent this letter to Lord Rothschild, a wealthy Jewish businessman, and he told him that His Majesty's government, the British government, looks favorably for the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that led to the exodus of many Jews into Palestine in anticipation of their homeland to being established. Come 47, 48, the 30s, the Holocaust happens. Jews are forced out. Many of them come to Palestine as well, facilitated and aided by the British Empire eventually. And then in 47, Jewish militias start basically a campaign of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. How do you create a Jewish homeland for the Jews while the land is populated by Palestinians? The solution is to transfer and to ethnically cleanse the land. So this is a work of an Israeli historian, Ilan Pape. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's a well-known book, was published a few years back, but he documents, based on declassified documents, the specific efforts by the Jewish militias, terrorist militias, to ethnically cleanse Palestine. By the end of the cleansing and until Israel was established as a state in May 14th, 1948, and the war that followed after that, 700,000 Palestinians, the majority of the population, was pushed out of Palestine. And they were pushed into refugee camps, whether internally in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. These were not recognized territories then, but they eventually became with a ceasefire agreement. And most of them became refugees in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, mostly in Jordan. And still today, those 700,000 refugees are today amount to 5 million refugees, are still refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and some in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, kicked out of their homeland and still waiting for the right of return. There's an UN resolution 242, that guarantees that Palestinians have a right to return to the land. Connecting this to Gaza, because we don't have a lot of time here, 70% of the people of Gaza are refugees. So these are first, second, and third generations of refugees who have been stuck in the Gaza Strip for the last 75 years, waiting to break out of Gaza and go back home. Gaza has been described as a concentration camp. If you just look at the circumstances in Gaza before the war, just the abhorrent living conditions, no drinking water, no infrastructure, unemployment is so super high, poverty, 60 or 70% of the people live under the poverty line, and just an abhorrent reality. You mentioned the blowback, Craig. These are refugees who have been living in refugee camps for generations. Are we surprised that the oppressed are going to revolt? Are we surprised that they're going to break out of jail, out of the concentration camp, and go out and avenge themselves? And we can talk about the killing of Palestinians throughout history. Just to focus on the Gaza Strip for that, just to give a context for Hamas and the attacks. In the last 16 years, since the Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip began, Israel waged at least four wars on Gaza, killing thousands of Gazans. In 2014, they killed more than 2,000 people. In 2021, they killed 400 Gazans, including women and children, scores of women and children. People talk today about self-defense, about Israel's right and duty. This is Blinken, right and duty to defend itself. Well, do Palestinians have a right to self-defense as well? Do the oppressed have a right to fight, to armed struggle, to fight against their oppression and victimization and dehumanization and oppression, or not? Palestinians are not giving the right to self-defense. None of what I'm saying here gives an excuse to Hamas to do what it did, but at least that's the context. That's the way that Hamas thinks, that we've been victims of a brutal occupation and oppression for 75 years. We are not from Gaza. We are from the land. We are from Haifa and Yafa and all these lands, and we need to go there. And just the last comment here. I don't know if your audience exactly, and how they think about the Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment ensures a right that should never be infringed for Americans to bear arms. And the language of that, and specifically talks about the formation of militias, and the right to bear arms could never be infringed upon Americans. And I think the Second Amendment is awful, and I completely disagree with it. And theologically, just basic theological kind of understandings, But when you talk with people who believe in the Second Amendment, they're saying, like, I ask them, why do you want to have guns? And they're like, well, guns are the way to protect ourselves from the tyranny of the government. That's how you can make sure that the government would be free, that we would not be terrorized by a tyrant government, the king or the current government. Hamas, believe it or not, uses the same logic. We're going to form militias to defend ourselves from the tyranny of the government. Now, what they did was they shouldn't have done what they did, and like the way they did it was awful, but it's the same mindset. We're going to formulate militias. We've been terrorized by this government, by a foreign government. This is not our own government. This is not Americans fighting the American government. This is Ukrainians fighting Russia, right? Like they came to our land, occupied Crimea, occupied Ukraine, bombed us day and night. We have the right to armed struggle and we have the right to fight back. And when Israel has been brutalizing and bombing Palestinians and killing us left and right, Hamas are part of a section of the population that says, yeah, we cannot stand for this. We would rather die. And there's a saying that they use, we'd rather die standing than live on our knees. And that's a discourse. And then there's like a lot of conversations. Well, is it, like, how do you explain killing civilians and so on? And we can, there's Hamas and others, explain that away. But that's part of the discourse. And if we're not understanding the legacy that of oppression and violence that lead people to armed struggle, to this belief that we need to defend ourselves no matter what, and if necessary, using weapons to kill and attack and commit horrible crimes against civilians, we're not going to be able to make any progress in the way that we think about Palestine and Israel and the Middle East. And that's the context. And again, the context is not meant to justify or explain away, but we need to be more nuanced in the way that we think about these things, and fundamentally to understand that violence begets violence, that oppression begets oppression, that you cannot underestimate a people's desire for freedom. Palestinians, for the most part, are nonviolent people, and Palestinian Christians, especially, we're committed to creative nonviolent resistance, following the scriptures and following the model of Christ. But the belligerence of Israel and the unwavering support from a very belligerent government in the US, the unconditional military support, $4 billion every year from our tax dollars go to support the Israeli military. And we expect the Palestinians to just cower and like lay down. It's not going to happen. Again, I have to keep like emphasizing this because I'm Palestinian. No justification for the attacks. But also the US and Israel has justified killing Palestinians left and right, whether from 48, the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, thousands were killed, massacres were committed. The last 16 years of blockade and wars on the Palestinians in Gaza. This year, before October 7th, 300 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank, not in Gaza Strip, not where Hamas is, in the West Bank, in where I live, where my family is. 300 Palestinians, including almost 40 children. No Hamas, no blockade, but they're killing Palestinians left and right. No one is talking about the Palestinians, is talking to the Palestinians or about the Palestinians who were killed in the West Bank. But whenever Israelis are killed, there are the podcasts, the newscasts, the breaking news in the West. But Palestinians, otherwise, they suffer, they die. We don't really pay attention to them. We only pay attention to the Palestinians whenever Israelis are killed. And that shows the inherent kind of, again, this is like the fourth time I say this, the racist and very dehumanizing discourse and way of thinking that exists, especially in the U.S.
Right. And I think anybody, all right, so I gave you some context about myself and messaging. I grew up, born and raised in West Texas. I was that guy, the Second Amendment guy, the gun guy. I was around guns my entire life. I've always, guns don't bother me, okay?
Right.
But I'm not defending Hamas or any Palestinian that wants to fight back. And I've heard you talk about this in other podcasts. You describe yourself as a raging pacifist.
Right.
I consider myself a pacifist now. I used to not be a pacifist. Now, as a pacifist, I can look at what's happening And nobody should be surprised that these folks are going to try and punch back at some point. Just like you said a while ago, the desire to be free
Right.
is inherent with everybody. Okay. So the idea that they're going to just sit idly by, I don't condone it, but I get it.
Mm-hmm.
I understand them wanting to defend themselves,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever that looks like to them, that's what they're going to do. And nobody should be surprised. It's one thing that was so funny to me. I don't know if funny is the right word, but when that Hamas attack, like I told you, I was sitting in the break room, and it says Israel surprised by latest Hamas attack, and I'm like, how can they be surprised at this point? Because Israel's been attacking them, from my understanding, attacking them for years.
Mm-hmm.
They shouldn't be surprised by this. And it reminded me, and I don't know if this is a bad comparison or not, but it reminded me of like how Americans were surprised by 9/11. The American government's been meddling in other people's business for years. At some point, they're going to fight back, okay? I don't know if it's a bad comparison or not. If it is, please correct me. But at the same time, I understand wanting to defend yourself, your family. I mean, if they were marching down our neighborhoods, and from what I understand, Israel is moving Palestinians out of their homes and moving Israelis into these people's homes and leaving them homeless.
Mm-hmm.
If that was happening in my neighborhood,
Yeah.
to my family and my friends, I can guarantee you, I don't think I'm going to sit idly by.
Yeah.
And I'm a pacifist. Now, if that means me losing my life, I'm not going to sit there and take it, though. My understanding of pacifism may be different than yours. Is like, my pacifism goes to where I'm just not willing to kill somebody back.
Mm-hmm.
Even if that means me losing my life. Now, that does not mean I'm not going to defend myself or my family. People take pacifism the wrong way and thinking that we're not just going to, I mean, if you got kids, I know pacifists that have kids.
Mm-hmm.
I do not believe that they're going to sit there and watch your kids be slaughtered without trying to get in between it. You know what I'm saying? So I don't know how when you call yourself a raging pacifist, that really caught my attention, because now I am a pacifist too. And it's something that's very important to me. It's hard to describe to some people because you think you're just not defending yourself. And I just don't think that's true.
Yeah. Let's unpack that. Before we do, you brought up the issue of if someone comes and attacks me, I don't know what I'm gonna do, and I'm gonna defend myself. Like if Israel in the last 16 years, we know this, waged 5 wars on Gaza, and we know that thousands of Palestinians in Gaza were killed. So these include children, mothers, fathers, cousins, what have you. So if my wife was killed, or my son was killed, or my nephew, or my fiance, or was killed, why wouldn't I want to join Hamas? Like, do we think that Israel, by killing 10,000 people are not gonna try to avenge themselves and avenge their loved ones? And like, you see the pictures when you talk about 4,000 children. Why wouldn't all these fathers pick up arms against the Israel? So is this the way you actually eradicate Hamas? Like, is this the way that you eradicate violence? No, it continues the cycle. Israel likes to paint this as this is self-defense, and all the language they use about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. But you're not solving the issue. One, you're ignoring the core issue that leads to Hamas, which is oppression, the occupation, a reality that has been described, Craig, by every reputable human rights organization in the world, whether it's Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, two Israeli human rights organizations, including Beit Salem, that this is a system of apartheid, like you had in South Africa. It's very comparable. It's different, obviously, but it's very comparable to apartheid in South Africa. Of course, there's going to be violence. Of course, in response to apartheid, there's going to be violence. Now, speaking about pacifism and what I mean, I think fundamentally it goes back to how I understand Jesus and how I understand the kingdom of God. And I think there is a clear model that is given to me in the scriptures about the kingdom of God that is counter to the way of the world. The way of Hamas and the way of Israel are the same. These are the ways of war and vengeance and wrath. And and it's counter to the way of the gospel, to the way of the kingdom of Christ. And the model of Christ on the cross is someone he did not try to escape, he did not try to fight back. He knew that his day would come, and he accepted it, and he went to the cross and cried, God, God, why have you forsaken me? But then through that attitude, the kingdom of God came on earth because of Christ's work on the cross. And there's this model of justice and peace that comes, and we can talk about what's the solution. And fundamentally, the solution is based on ensuring justice for the Palestinians and for the Israelis, a justice that leads to peace. And it is the justice of God that fundamentally shows itself on the cross. And through that justice, peace and reconciliation follow. Peace between God and humanity among itself. So that's kind of the model that I adopt, of this kind of radical pacifism that does not inflict violence, but actually receives violence. And that's the way of the kingdom. And that's the radical way of Jesus when he says in the Sermon on the Mount to love your enemies and to love your neighbors as yourself. How do you love your enemy if you're killing the enemy? Like, those do not go hand in hand. And there's a radical message in the gospel. And I'm sorry, like, Jesus was a radical. Jesus, the way of the gospel is counterintuitive, upside down, irrational to the ways of the world, how Israel thinks and how the US thinks and how Hamas thinks. I'm stuck with it. I mean, when I read the Sermon on the Mount, there's nothing else there's no conclusion I can reach, but that my commandment, all of the law, is summarized in one: loving God and loving my neighbor. And for me as a Palestinian, I'm commanded to love my neighbor, which is my Muslim or my Jewish neighbor, but also love my enemy, who was the Israeli neighbor. And there's nothing I can do. I'm shackled by this love that I have to have for people. And I have to fight against every impulse of anger, of vengeance, of violence that I have in me. And that's the challenge of following after Christ, I think, in the way of the gospel. Now, you mentioned some stuff about, well, what if people come and attack me and, being slapped on the one cheek? The way we think about this as Palestinians, it's not pacifism in the sense of come and beat me up. I'm not going to stand for myself. We see the example of Jesus when he talks about turning the other cheek. I don't know how you read this, Craig, but when you turn the other cheek, you're not telling the person to beat you up. You're telling the person to think about what that person is doing. In a way, you're embarrassing that person. He expects you to cower down and fall on your knees to be beaten up and just kind of surrender. But when you lift your head up and you turn the other cheek, you're challenging him. When Jesus is being attacked and mocked in the questioning on Passion Week, he asks people. He asks them, "Why do you beat me? Why do you attack me?" He's challenging people to think about their biases and their impulses and their anger. So this is not passive, beat me up, I'm a whipping boy. It's saying, I'm going to challenge you. I'm going to see the humanity in you, and I'm going to challenge you to discover that humanity. So that's, for me, what pacifism does. It's a subversive response to violence that doesn't respond to violence by violence, but tries to transform violence by emphasizing the humanity of the others, of the violent, of the attacker, of the oppressor. Palestinian Christians have released a document, and I would love for you and others to read it. It's called Kairos Palestine, Kairos Palestine, and it kind of gives the Palestinian kind of understanding of our reality and how do we respond to it from our faith. And Kairos makes this document that the duty of the Christian is to resist. Resistance is the duty of the Christian, but it is not resistance with the logic of violence, but it's with the logic of love that finds creative ways to affirm the humanity of the oppressed and the oppressor. So, like, my raging pacifism is an attitude that is devoted to restoring the image of God in both people. In the violent person who denied the image of God and likeness in themselves by adopting violence as a way of living, by practicing violence, and by restoring the humanity, the image of God in the oppressed, who has been dehumanized and been victimized by the oppressor. So this is the theoretical backing. Now, what does that look like in the Palestinian context? it's this unwavering adherence to nonviolent resistance, whether it's in being on podcasts right now, or like writing or speaking or diplomacy or interfaith dialogue, or boycotting products, what is called BDS, the boycott, divestments and sanctions movement, that kind of is inspired by the civil rights movement in the US, boycotting buses, and what's happening in, for example, we saw this in the 60s in the US, or what happened in South Africa and India, finding creative ways to destabilize the power and then the economy of oppression and violence. And in doing so, challenging the oppressor to like be aware of their bigotry and their racism, and hopefully lead them to that process of transformation, to let go of their weapons and of forming their weapons into their swords, into plowshares, and kind of bringing about that prophetic imagination about the kingdom of God, of truth and peace and justice for all people. So that's kind of where we begin to think about it. This is not a discourse, Craig, that is common or familiar, could be very offensive to people in the West, especially in the US, in the country where there are more guns than there are people. But I think the way of the US is not the way of the gospel. The way of the US is the way of the empire, the way of colonialism, the way of oppression, the way of that maximizes profit over people, of a military industry complex, of adventurism, of racism that is kind of informs and in the DNA of the American political analysis and practice. But that's not the way of the cross. That's not the way of Jesus. And we need to challenge that. And I think you do that well, it seems, at your podcast, Craig. And we have to do more work on this, especially to examine how we use our theology to dehumanize and whitewash oppression of people who are beloved by God, who are made in his image and likeness. And we need to fight and to advocate and stand up for justice and truth, especially for the oppressed. And there's a theological conversation about what is called the preferential option for the poor. And it's the understanding that God takes sides, that God's on the side of the oppressed. And if you read this through the text, this is a very common, this is a trope, or like an idea that is found throughout the Bible, from beginning until the end, from the death of Abel until Christ and the church, that God is fundamentally cares about the oppressed, the weak, the children, the women, the minorities, the handicapped, the Samaritans, these the ones who are rejected and abused by society. These are the ones that God favors. And you see this in the Old Testament, in how it speaks about freedom, and how it speaks about being aliens, and about the strangers in your midst, talking about the widow and the poor. You see this in the ministry of Jesus. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, not in Jerusalem, who hung out with the tax collectors and those who are shunned by society, and going all the way to the first church that challenged the authorities and the empire. And that's the model that we need to be following. And I don't think the US as an empire, as based on power and domination and profit, is the way that it thinks about these things. And the US has to reckon with this. And I think there's judgment. If you talk about judgment, there's judgment on those who reject this way of the gospel. And our call to Christians in the West to adopt this way of violence and power and domination is to repent, like to follow, to move away from these ways of violence and death and warmongering, and follow in the ways of Christ, in the ways of love and of mercy, in the way of the cross. And there's so much work that needs to be done, Craig. We mentioned this about churches, about politicians, about the media. There's a lot of repentance, I think, that churches and Christians in the West need to do right now.
I agree. It reminds me of a conversation I was having with somebody the other day too, and how he was surprised at how Hamas was able to attack Israel the way it did. And maybe that's God judging his own people. And I said, man, I don't see in war, I don't see God in any of that. I said, that's all evil. That's all satanic to me. You mentioned the empire of the United States, the empire, we see very clearly in Scripture who backs the kingdoms of this world. Mm-hmm. And Jesus had no interest in it when he was offered that power by Satan. So when I see what's going on, I don't see God. I see evil. Okay, and now I'm not saying that God can't show up and fix things. That's not what I'm saying. But I don't think that he's had anything to do with that. I think there's a big misrepresentation of God in scriptures, or how people read scripture when it comes to war and stuff. I just don't, because when Jesus said, "When you've seen me, you've seen the Father," there was nothing about the life of Jesus that would suggest Hamas attacking Israel or vice versa. Okay.
Yeah, this is a very problematic theology. I mean, we have to have a conversation about this stuff, and um, this idea of that God is punishing people by killing them. So you think that killing babies and women is God? Like, what understanding of God is this? This is a bloodthirsty God. Like he punishes the living by killing others. Like he kills some people to punish the rest. Like, is this how God works? Like, it's such a weird theology. But also, like you said, the phrase that your friend used is that God is punishing his people. So the assumption is that God has a people who are the Jewish people.
Yeah.
And then, but I thought Christians are God's people.
Yeah.
But then all of humanity is God's people. So like, what are we saying? Like, do you saying that Jews who reject Jesus are God's people?
Yeah.
Because of their DNA? Like, it's so weird to me, like to think about it. And like, we can talk about the Bible and how we should be reading the Bible. But the people of God are those who follow after God, those who live in the way of God, in the way of mercy and goodness, not those who have a certain bloodline or who are circumcised. And Jesus challenges this all the way. He would go to the Pharisees, the Jewish leaders, and he would tell them, "You are the sons of the devil." But wait, but they are God's chosen people. No, it's not about your DNA. It's about you. Do you follow after that way of God? And he challenged all the authority at his time, the Jewish authority. If you jump to Paul, to Galatians 3, it says that Abraham believed and it was considered to him as righteousness, not because of his circumcision. Actually, he was not a Jew at the time, right? Jews are the products, the sons of Judah, the son of Jacob, who is Israel, the son of Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. So, but then he says, faith is, you are considered in the people of God because of your faith, not because of your genealogy. Righteousness comes to you through faith, not through your DNA. And Paul rejects this all the way. And then in Galatians 3:16 and later on, it says that those of faith are of righteousness, and it's not those of the blood. And he says there's no difference between Jew and Gentile, man and woman. All are one in Christ Jesus. There's genealogy. Actually, Paul, in somewhere else, he says, do not follow foolish talks about genealogies. Doesn't really matter. What matters is your faith. And if you belong to Christ, I think 3:29, you are the offspring of Abraham and heirs according to the promise. Your sonship, your belonging to the family of God is not because of your DNA. It's because if you believe in Christ, then you are heirs according to the promise. So Paul and Jesus move us away from this very disturbing, limited way of thinking that God has favoritism, that he has one specific people over others. There's no distinction between people. And God's love and God's goodness is offered to everyone, not to a special treatment of people vis-a-vis others. This is not the way of the gospel. This is a very, very bad reading of the Old Testament that ignores Jesus, ignores what we see in Paul, and goes to Deuteronomy, goes to Ezekiel, and then hop over Jesus as he doesn't exist, as there's nothing that happened with the Jesus event. And we just read the text out of context and without Christ. And this is like a very problematic way that you want to read the Old Testament and ignore Jesus. Like, this is like heretical. Like, we do not understand our faith without Jesus. Jesus is the cornerstone of our faith.
Yeah.
Like no king but Christ, right? Like I see this banner behind you. Like, Christ is the way he's the way that explains everything to us. In him, we find our yes and amen. In him, everything is fulfilled. And for Christians to say these are God's chosen people, because I read this in Deuteronomy or in Ezekiel, you're saying that Christ doesn't matter, that Christ is not significant to the way I think about this stuff. And this is a huge problem. So there's a lot of this, there's a lot of just baggage and really garbage theology that influences the way that we think about these things. And force us to turn a blind eye to oppression. If these are God's chosen people, then whatever they do is okay because they're God's chosen people. We need to support God's chosen people, even though they're choosing the way of vengeance and death and killing 10,000 people, 4,000 children. These are God's chosen people, and we are so blind in supporting them no matter what. This is where this very horrible theology leads to justifying death and violence and a genocide in Gaza.
100%. You know, when we saw Jesus coming, when he came back, you could see him trying to correct all this bad theology. And now even in 2023, we're still trying to correct bad theology.
He opens the book on the road to Emmaus, and he opens the scriptures, and he says, all of what you're reading here on the way to Emmaus are all about me, all testify to me.
Yeah.
And it says, whatever promises were made, Paul says, they find their yes, their amen, their finality in Jesus. And we're still like the blind people on the road to Emmaus. We do not know how to read the Bible.
Yeah.
And it's so problematic,
And it causes a lot of the stuff that we're seeing
exactly.
in Israel and Palestine now. And it
is Christians. It is Christians fundamentally. You have the left, the progressive left, who are saying, no, human rights and dignity and ceasefire and humanitarian pause or ceasefire. But it is the Christians who are saying, no, kill them all, no ceasefire. And you see people like Russell Moore, like David French, is like, yes, all the way, and these are like, supposedly good people, ethicists, and who care about these things. But, and this is coming from the pulpit, like you said in the beginning of the podcast, coming from influential evangelical voices and others who are so following the way of the world. Like if a Christian says that, and then a non-Christian says that, the same thing, like, how are you different? How does your Christianity impact the way you think? If the way you think and the way you behave is just like the world, I really question your faith. I really question the way, if you take Jesus seriously or not.
Right. 100%. Because you mentioned the Sermon on the Mount a while ago. All you got to do is go back to the Sermon on the Mount.
Yeah.
And if you can't read the Sermon on the Mount and realize what's happening right now is not right and not the way of Jesus, you need to keep reading it.
Yeah.
Keep reading it until it sticks, because for some reason it's not getting into your brain the way it should.
Yeah. There's a lot of repentance, I think, that Christians in the West need to do, especially those who are supporting this war. You need to repent.
Daniel, I want to maybe keep you on like retainer, get you back on the show at some point. If we got something, I know we're going to have other things to talk about. We could go. You just started a new podcast. You have some partners, and if you want to plug that and whatever you want to plug, then people can find your podcast. I'll let you get out of here.
Yeah, thanks, Craig. So I mentioned one book, Ilan Pape, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Check that out. There's also a book by Rashid Khalidi. Rashid, Rashid Khalidi. He's a Palestinian historian at Columbia University. He wrote the book, The 100 Years' War on Palestine. So check that out. Craig, I can send you a resource packet I put together of different books, documentaries, videos, podcasts, and so on that people can just open the file and look up. And I provide a paragraph description for every documentary, film, or book, and also hyperlinks for them to buy the books from Amazon or to stream from YouTube or what have you. So I ask the audience to do their due diligence, whether it's reading stuff on theology and the land, whether it's reading about the politics and the history. You need to do your job. You need to do your due diligence. Try to understand what's happening there before you say anything about it. And to have this kind of plug about my own podcast, I just launched a podcast with some friends. It's called Across the Divide, and it's a collaboration between Palestinian Christians and American Christians, and having conversations about faith and social justice in relation to Palestine, Israel, in connection with the church in the U.S. and the West in general. So it's Across the Divide. It's available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts, and so on. But I guess we can also provide the link in the show notes, Craig, as well for that. Yeah.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Also, I'm going to check out your podcast. I heard you talk about it when I heard you on these other podcasts, they hadn't quite launched yet. So I was looking for it, couldn't find it, but now you're saying it's out. So
we just launched it 3 days ago.
Perfect.
The first episode of the podcast, we meet with a Palestinian theologian from Gaza. He was born in Gaza. Currently, he lives in Bethlehem. But he is a wonderful theologian, very articulate. Talks about life in Gaza, what it's like, and how he thinks about Hamas. And the second episode, I alluded to some of the content here. We're basically dealing with Christian responses to Hamas and violence, and kind of basically unpacking some of the arguments made by Christians, by politicians about just war theory, about kind of the attitudes towards violence and Hamas, and kind of responding to them. So it's looking like kind of a fun podcast. So I highly recommend people to check it out across the divide. And and even if they don't want to listen to it, if you just kind of subscribe and follow and just kind of play it on mute, just to help us get some downloads, that would be very nice as well.
No, I think people are going to listen to it because it's an important topic. I mean, it's something, when this it seems like this stuff gets quiet for a little bit, and then all of a sudden something blows up again, and then we're talking about it again.
Mm-hmm.
Like it never ends. And you mentioned something earlier about violence begets violence, and it continues that. We've got to get away from that, figure out a way to get away from that, and just start following the teachings of Christ. I know that's hard to say to non-Christians, but at the same time, Christians who are claiming to follow Jesus, let's start following Jesus and stop supporting this garbage that's going on, this evil. It's absolute evil. And I think you're doing fantastic work, and I really appreciate you coming on the show and speaking with us. I think our listeners are going to enjoy this. They've been looking forward to hearing from you. I've been talking. We have a private discussion group on Facebook. Mentioned to them that you're coming on the show, and because it's something that they have questions about, because maybe some of them are stuck like I was in my old way of thinking, and they're trying to figure out. I had a guy text me, a really good friend of mine. He texted me the other day. He goes, "You got any ammunition I could share with people as far as what's going on in Palestine?" And I sent him your episode on theology on the raw, and he listened to it, and he goes, "I wish more people would listen to this guy and get an idea of what's actually going on there," because it's like I said in the very beginning of the show, there's a lot of confusion.
I'm happy to help. Hopefully people would listen. Hopefully people would also check out the resources, follow your podcast and mine, and do their work, put in the work and the time into educating themselves. And just kind of finish with this: stand for truth, stand for love, the way of the cross, stand for justice for the Palestinians, fight for Israelis. If you will find yourself as a pro-Israel, fight for Israelis, but do that also, and then also fight for Palestinians. I'm not asking you to be anti-Israel. I'm asking you to be pro-people, pro-justice, pro-Palestinians, and pro-Israelis. This is not one either or. This is both and. Fundamentally, we need to be driven by concern for justice and for mercy, and that's the way you should act as a Christian and also as an American and anyone else, really. And I just kind of encourage everyone, just kind of take this seriously, pursue truth and justice, and be the change you want to see. Play a role, an active role. You have a lot of privilege and power in the U.S. and freedom. Use that well. Educate people, educate yourself, and advocate for people who have no voice, and speak for the oppressed, and kind of help bring about that reality of goodness and truth that we need for the world today.
Yes, sir. Completely agree with you. Well said. Well said. I'm going to let you get out of here, and I'm going to go run to work and maybe I'll bring up this conversation in the break room at work tonight. We'll see. We'll see what happens.
Sounds good.
All right, buddy. I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Bad Roman Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you find your podcasts to never miss an episode. And while you're at it, if you like what you heard, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, it really helps people find us. 100% of donations are given to local charities in Memphis, Tennessee. To learn more about the Bad Roman Project and to find show notes, please visit thebadroman.com.